Hola, buenos días o buenas noches, según corresponda. Yo soy Horacio Pérez y os doy la bienvenida al podcast Investigando la Investigación, el podcast donde hablaremos sobre temáticas muy relevantes dentro del mundo de la investigación, como en qué temas actuales y de impacto se está investigando en todo el mundo, cómo llevan a cabo su investigación los investigadores y cómo es su vida y día a día, qué les motiva a investigar y qué problemas se encuentran y resuelven para poder seguir adelante. Y además nos centraremos no solo en la investigación académica, sino también en la transferencia tecnológica y en cómo se realiza la investigación en las empresas. Hola, muy buenos días. Hoy es lunes 22 de marzo de 2022. El episodio del viernes pasado estuvo relacionado con la bioinformática estructural y este episodio también va a ser el caso. Como os comenté, voy a tratar de traer un episodio por semana para los que siguen o están centrados en esta línea, pero no olvidemos que este podcast está originalmente concebido para que hablemos de todos los temas que nos interesan de investigación en cualquier área. Dentro de poco vamos a tener algunas nuevas entrevistas que hace mucho tiempo que no hacemos, entrevistas en directo, entiéndase, y vais a ver algunos trabajos muy interesantes de áreas que no tienen nada que ver a veces incluso ni con la parte más científica. Bueno, pues entonces el programa de hoy es una entrevista al profesor Hugo Verli de la Universidad de Río Grande del Sur de Brasil y es un experto en la técnica de dinámica molecular y nos va a comentar muchos detalles y muchas cosas interesantes acerca de cómo él aplica esta técnica y en qué contextos está trabajando. Por otra parte, hoy tenemos una novedad en este podcast y es que la entrevista es una entrevista que grabé en noviembre pasado. La entrevista es completamente en inglés. Entonces, a partir de ahora, me parece muy interesante traer a este podcast a algunos investigadores que, como no hablan castellano, pues esas entrevistas tendrán que ser, obviamente, en inglés. Entonces, esto es lo que hay. Los que podéis seguir el inglés, yo no soy inglés nativo, lo siento, lo intentaré hacer lo mejor posible, pero los que podéis seguir el inglés, os recomiendo que os quedéis. Y los que no, pues daré algunos enlaces en las notas del programa para que podáis ver las partes más interesantes de la entrevista. También me gustaría saber vuestra opinión sobre si seguir incluyendo o no entrevistas en inglés en este podcast. El contenido mayormente seguirá siendo en castellano, pero estas entrevistas, por estos motivos que os estoy comentando, serán algunas de ellas a partir de ahora en inglés y otras muchas de ellas en castellano. De momento no tengo pensado incluir ningún otro idioma más, también porque no controlo ningún otro. Bueno, sí que hice mi diploma de C1 en alemán, en francés no se me daba mal hace mucho tiempo, pero bueno, lo que os comentaba. Entonces, por no enrollarme más, paso ya a continuación al episodio de la entrevista con el profesor Hugo Verli y a partir de ahora totalmente en inglés. Gracias por estar ahí y espero que os quedéis un buen rato. Hasta luego.
In today's show, we are going to interview Professor Hugo Verli. Hugo is an expert in molecular dynamics, which is a technique that allows, by using computer simulations, to study the dynamics of systems of biological relevance. Hi, we have the pleasure to have today in our podcast Hugo Verli from Porto Alegre, Brazil. Hi, Hugo, how are you?
Hi, Horacio. I'm fine. Thank you for the invitation.
And thanks a lot to you for accepting the invitation to the podcast. Hugo Verli is a professor in the University of Porto Alegre, but before, I think it would be better if you, Hugo, can introduce yourself. Could give some information about who you are and what you do, please?
Okay. Well, I'm located at the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, in Brazil, in the Center for Biotechnology at this university. My formation is, I'm a pharmacist from undergrad basics, and I followed a master's degree in organic chemistry and a PhD in molecular and cell biology. But my main research area was always on the molecular modeling of compounds. So it's the general area I'm within, and where I'm doing my research until now.
Okay. How did you get into research, and why did you end on this field?
I started on this field on the second semester for my pharmacy school, and I think it was a colleague that met a guy in an institute in Brazil with a molecule in his computer rotating in the screen. And when he mentioned that made me very, very curious about the field. How can I model the protein structure and in the computer? Well, at the time, the computers were not so common, but rolling a molecule in the screen called very much my attention. So after that conversation, I started to talk with some people that recommended me a guy that worked in this field. And I started that in 1997 and remained since then in the same field. I was passionate about that.
Okay. And when was it the moment where you decided that you wanted to do a PhD, or you decided later, or how did that happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I never planned much. I never reflected much about the long term, but I thought about what I liked to do, and I enjoyed very much since the beginning doing science. So leaving the university without doing science was not a question. So in Brazil we usually do the master before the PhD, and what's the obvious decision to remain doing science. After the PhD, it was a little bit more complicated. I never thought to be a professor, to teach. I thought doing science. But at some moment, I decided to also teach. I thought very much about the professors I had and how much professors I didn't like it. So not to be too hypocrite, I thought, well, if I criticize so much my professors, I need to show that I can do better, or at least try. So, and since then, teaching is mostly an intimate part of my relation with science.
Okay, very, very interesting. And then during your PhD, you decided somehow to go into the line of molecular dynamics. Is that correct?
I moved to molecular dynamics a little bit before entering my master's. Before that, I was mostly on ligand-based drug discovery and dealing a little bit with conformation analysis, but it was the start of the popularization of molecular dynamics techniques. So at the time, my advisor bought a Silicon Graphics workstation, very fancy and expensive, with a very expensive software, and I started learning at that moment. And those results were after a little bit after used in the Journal of Medicinal Chemistry paper, and it showed me that ligands within binding sites could achieve very different orientations than those obtained by docking, and that increased my passion to learn to move more than to just model the systems, but to model their dynamics. And my master was on the since then I work mostly on molecular dynamics, and my master, my PhD, initially in my master degree of acetylcholinesterase, and then during my prostaglandin and the peroxysyntase, and from my PhD to nowadays, I started working a lot with proteins from the coagulation cascade.
And could you explain briefly for the audience that are not familiar with molecular dynamics techniques what molecular dynamics is and what it needs?
Okay. Okay, well, the idea of molecular dynamics, I like the idea to compare molecular dynamics with a movie and a photo. When we model just the three-dimensional structure of a protein, we're seeing a photo, not a movie. And when we run a molecular dynamics, we're seeing the movie. So if you select just a snapshot from your movie, you don't know which part of the movie this snapshot represents. Is it the moment of when somebody is killed, or the moment when somebody performs some heroic acts? We don't know if this photo represents the movie. And with molecular dynamics is the same. So we need to look for the entire movie to understand how the story is told, what happens in the story. So the physics for molecular dynamics is quite simple. It's basically solving the Newton's second law, considering the force equals to mass plus acceleration, and we integrate this equation in relation to time and to the position of the atoms. So the basic physics is simple, but the kind of results we can obtain, it's very complex. To understand this movie and to see, well, why the atom moving in this direction represents something useful or not? Why this movement is relation to the protein function or to pathology, or how can we use this movie to help in drug discovery? That is the challenging part. But the principle of the method is not so complicated. I'm not sure it was much clear, but
yeah, I think it's clear explanation. Yeah, right. And you mentioned before, okay, perhaps should we also add that this kind of simulations, this kind of computer simulations cannot usually be run on a normal desktop computer or laptop or a smartphone nowadays, and you need access to supercomputers. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a nice point to discuss. I would say that depends a little bit. Depends on the size of the problem you want to deal, and to which degree of quality you want to answer the question. I'm not sure you could, if there is an implementation for smartphones, but for notebook and personal computers, you can run the programs. And depending on the size of the molecular systems you are studying, that is the number of atoms, you can run pretty good simulations. For one example, we are running a lot of simulations for drugs, just the drugs in water. Okay. And these are small molecules. With molecules like that, you can run in your personal computer pretty good simulations. But for protein-containing systems and for more solid solid experiments, you usually need to go for supercomputers that you are mentioning. I agree with that. For most applications, supercomputers are a must to properly perform these methods in the state of the art.
Right. I was wrong before. Yeah, exactly. Only, yeah. And in order to give some idea for the listeners of the podcast, which kind of supercomputer, how big is a supercomputer, how do we use such supercomputer in order to have an idea?
Well, usually, I think one interesting point that's molecular dynamics is a process that depends mostly on the processors and not on, for example, disk writing. So you don't need a supercomputer focused on SSD, for example. You need a solid CPU and ideally GPU. And you not necessarily need a very big supercomputer, you could use like those personal supercomputers with like some processors or like 2 or 3 workstations, not even one workstation with 2 processors with a lot of cores and a nice GPU. You could run nice simulations. Don't need a huge supercomputer. And it's important to realize, and I think a lot of the users don't realize, you need to evaluate if your molecular systems scales well on the supercomputer. So to use supercomputers depend on the scalability of your software and of your molecular system. Depending on the system you are running, the scalability could be worse or could be better. So not necessarily run on 2,000 CPUs would be the best for your case. Perhaps 100 CPUs would do the job pretty well.
Right. And what could you say in terms of, let's say, money? If we have one of these personal supercomputers, how much money should a lab spend on this? It's complicated questions.
Yeah,
I know.
We bought one recently. I think it was like you can buy nice stuff. I think between around $20,000. From $15,000 to $20,000, you start being able to buy nice stuff to run more serious simulations. One recent advance in this field is the ability to use the Google servers to run simulations. Some former students of mine implemented an OpenMM version on Google Colab. So you can run Dynamics with a very good speed without expending money. So for some kind of works, you could even use Google Colab instead of having a computer within your lab.
And this Google Colab, is this for free?
Yes, it's for free. It's for free. You have limitations about the time for the process, but you can perform a loop and increase your simulation pretty quick in a couple of days.
Very interesting. Wow. So then I wonder here, what does Google get from this? Because it's offering computing resources for free to everybody. I don't know. I guess this is some marketing strategy or something, but it looks good.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if they will let we do that for much time, but for now it's working. We do that even in undergrad classes. The students start with this implementation of Google Colab and can perform molecular dynamics pretty easily.
That's good for everybody. Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. And regarding molecular dynamics, you said you did apply this to some specific systems. Which systems are you working now on?
Well, for some time, particularly as a consequence of the lowering in accessibility of science funding in Brazil, we moved from large molecular systems to small molecular systems because with that move, we could remain in the state of the art in the application of the techniques, but and obtain solid answers from the simulations. I mentioned that the molecular dynamics is like a movie, so we needed to see the movie in its entirely. So if we only see a part of the movie, we probably will have a result that is not so solid. But to obtain the entire movie, well, for proteins we cannot obtain the entire movie. That's another question. But for small molecules, synthetic molecules, peptides, natural products, we can obtain the entire movie for its behavior in solution. So the answer we could offer it's close to the limit, the theoretical limit of the technique. We can, for example, reproduce pretty well the folding of some small peptides or the conformation of natural products or drugs, and compare to solution experiments like NMR, and reproduce with a very high accuracy some experimental data. So we are currently working with some drugs, with some peptides, and we work a lot of sugars, small sugars, larger sugars, glycoconjugates, sugars bounded to other molecules. And we are starting to develop some projects considering carbohydrate binding proteins and also some metal channels in plants.
Okay. And why did you decide to focus on these sugars, carbohydrates?
That was a little bit of let's say a serendipitous occurrence in my life. My advisor on the PhD had a very solid career on the anticoagulant agents, and at the time when I searched to talk with him to make my PhD in his lab, he proposed me to study low molecular weight heparins that have some particular properties. And at the end, I wasn't able to study these molecules, but I ended working a lot with heparin and with their binding proteins. And I realized that most of the proteins that heparin binds are glycosylated. So I faced carbohydrates from the heparin side, or glycosaminoglycans, as we say, and for the glycosylation part in proteins. And then I started to realize the importance of carbohydrates. At the time, we had only one set of parameters for force field calculations, just putting some technicalities, but to simulate carbohydrates. At the time was the Umbra glycan. So we needed to develop our own parameters to work with carbohydrates. But nowadays we have more infrastructure, more parameters to work with these molecules.
And for the listeners that don't have experience about this, what is a force field, and why should you obtain these kind of parameters?
Yes, I mentioned the term and not define it. When we solve the Newton laws, the Newton second laws, the force needs to be established. We know the mass of the atoms. The acceleration comes from theoretical distribution of velocities, so we don't need to work, and depends on the temperature. So we need to define the temperature, and from the temperature we derivate the velocity of the acceleration and velocity of the atoms. But the forces that guides how the atoms interact is not established. So we needed to produce an equation that represents the force, how the force between the atoms acts. And that equation is called the force field. It's a combination of several functions that describe how atoms interact between each other. And these equations are pretty simple. For example, we have some most of the equations, in fact, we saw that before our undergrad studies. We see equations to the spring movement, the Hooke law. We see equations for Coulomb interactions. We also saw that usually before faculty. And from these simple equations, we derive a lot of applications to describe how the bond between two atoms may stretch, how angles between atoms may change, and how atoms not bounded chemically may also interact. So the combination of these equations defines the force field. But the force field needs to be adjusted to each kind of atoms and molecules that you are studying. And we have these parameterizations already done for most of biomolecules like proteins, but for particular classes of molecules like carbohydrates, lipids, DNA, RNA, we may face some challenges. So we needed to parameterize for carbohydrates. DNA, for example, is a problem for some force fields, and RNA is a particular challenge. Synthetic compounds, the easiest part is to model proteins and possibly lipids. I'm not sure if moved too far from your question.
No, I think it's great. I think it's great. Just to get an idea. And this is a question for myself. So it looks like it's kind of different molecule, because you said for proteins, one force field, another force field for all parameters, sorry. So how hard is to get these parameters? Should you spend a lot of time in their derivation, or this is something easy to get?
Yeah, it may be very challenging. You need to collect a serious amount of experimental data, and you will adjust your equations to reproduce those experimental data. Okay. Some force fields are based on crystal structures. So you adjust the equations of your force field to reproduce the geometry of molecules in experimentally determined structures from mainly X-ray crystallography.
Okay.
Force fields work with the reproduction of solution data, condensed phase data, like density or heat of vaporization. You have a lot of experimental data in solution, and that you can use to calibrate your force field. And another way to see that, you are training a set of equations. So you use a lot of experimental data to train your equations, and then you must validate your equations to see if you reproduce well the experimental data. It usually is very complicated because you need to guarantee that your parameters work well, not only for one molecule, but for the family of molecules. But for, in fact, we don't produce the force field. Within a same force field, we add parameters for some specific class of molecules. So we use some that were previously determined, and we add some parameters for specific behaviors that we want to work. So it's not an entire force field we produce. We just add some parameters, just not give the idea that we build the entire force field. Not many people, many groups in the world have experience to seriously produce new force fields. There are some force fields recently developed in literature, but the main force fields we can include in like 3 to 4 families of force fields that are currently using large scale use in the world.
Okay. Very difficult, but very
technical.
Very technical. No, but I think it's necessary. Probably there is some listeners on the audience that are also working on this. But you mentioned also that something about training and then processing information. And now we are in the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning. I guess this is being used also on this area.
Yes, it is increasing. The use of this machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques are increasing a lot in the field. Some parameters are being adjusted using this kind of techniques. One of the main challenges is that we don't possess experimental data to train our models for all situations we need to do. Okay. So how can we obtain the data to validate something? I cannot validate a lot of some of the calculations we've done because we just don't have this kind of experimental data. So the use of artificial intelligence, very well-trained models, has shown to be very precise in the reproduction of data for which we don't have experimental information. And one example is AlphaFold, but we have other examples. And I think that in the near future, we will see a solid modification in the force fields toward the use of machine learning techniques more broadly. The literature shows examples like that, but I think this will change the landscape of the field in the near future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you mean one of the next breakthroughs will be related with machine learning and artificial intelligence. Do you think this will be the main one on your area of research in molecular dynamics, or do you think there will be also others? Well, this is very complicated to predict.
No, I think that a solid use of machine learning producing more accurate models, I think it will be a major breakthrough. But I would like to mention that we usually think about the technique, but I like to think that one major breakthrough is one of the main major breakthroughs to come is not breakthroughs, the plural, are not located on the technique, but on the use of the technique, on how can we in fact use the technique to derivate new observations, new insights, new applications of science. The tool is hugely important, but we also need to know how to use the tool. And with better tools, we need to learn better ways to use the same tools. And so I think this is a main challenge also, to not think only on the names, but also on the goals you want to pursue.
Right. Okay. I agree completely. There are many ways in which you can, but okay. And we got into a lot of different details about the science that Hugo Verli is doing now. I think this is an exciting research field. Yeah. Now I wanted to ask you, for you as a researcher, what were your most pleasant and not so pleasant times as a researcher in science? I mean, what was your most relevant discovery from your point of view?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that I don't think on that, at least in my career, based on individual papers. But I think my main contribution is helping the community to visualize the importance of including carbohydrates on their models. We started modeling glycoproteins when few people in literature modeled them. Now it's more common. We keep at the time we keep track about the modeling papers on the modeling of glycoproteins literature, and for some time I have most of the papers in this field. Now it's became very common, so I think we helped to the community to understand the importance of including carbohydrates in when proteins are glycosylated, or the importance to model carbohydrates. And this is with the more recent movements towards glycomimetics as potential drugs, I think this is not only a matter of understanding biological phenomena, but also in producing, in developing products and developing new drugs. And possibly on this reinforcement for the community about the role of carbohydrates and importance to model them, possibly the development of procedures and of parameters to help the community to produce their own models on glycoproteins or carbohydrates in general.
Okay. And what is now, not going into technical details or science, but what is, regarding science and research, what you like the most and the least?
That's a curious question. I like to see nice applications of the techniques, always searching for the limits of the techniques, always showing how can we expand the quality of the level in which we apply these techniques. I like to also look on the experimental papers, looking for problems that we can model, that we can expand in our techniques. So I keep my attention to biochemistry, some molecular biology, pharmacology. I have a fascination about natural products, their chemical diversity. So I like to see unusual structures that appears in literature from plants and other organisms. And so I would say that's a broad interest in both in methods, but also in the problems that we could model.
Many things to see then, right?
Yeah.
And wow. And finally, how is your? Would you describe how is a day in your life regarding what you do on research? You spend most of the time reading papers, or you prefer to make some computer code for your simulations, or what do you do?
Yeah, well, nowadays I have I'm head of a graduate program, and we are one of the best programs in Brazil. So very time consuming. So I have little time to be in the lab. Most of my time in science. Well, removing the part that it's bureaucratic. I expend a lot of time advising my students, so they do the most hard work. But also in reading some papers and reviewing papers from literature, I learn a lot about that also. So I would say mostly on bureaucratic stuff. We have also a solid amount of time in teaching. And besides that, advising my students, discussing with them results, discussing papers they found, and for myself, a smaller amount of time usually nowadays is available to read and to review papers, but this is a mandatory step in our daily life.
Oh, a lot of things you are doing every day. A lot of things. Okay. Now I would like to ask you way more questions because this is very interesting, but we are running a little bit out of time in the podcast. So in order to finalize it, usually the previous interviewee asks a question for the next researcher, even if he or she doesn't know who will answer the question. So the previous question for you would be from Romain Danot from Carlos Institute of Technology would be, how do you think one can be more efficient in his or her work? I mean, I guess efficient in terms of productivity, I guess.
Okay, that's a good question. I would say that it's planning your daily work. You need to have a good plan of what you have to do, when you have to do, of your deadlines. You need a lot of organization. I think this is the in my opinion, the best approach to have a more productive. In addition, if I may, I would say that taking particular care of your mental health. Because if you're not healthy mentally, you won't be productive. So you need to take care of your anxiety, of your possible passion. If you are anxious, you'll not produce anything. And the youngest students or youngest scientists are suffering more about this kind of problem. We also, but I think they are suffering more. So the increase in mental problems in mental health is huge. So they need to be to go to a nice professional and perhaps to make receive some pharmacological help. But this could help aid a lot in gaining productivity. I need my pharmacological help. Without it, I certainly won't produce as much as I produce nowadays.
Okay, that's very interesting, and I think there are thousands of books and methods for efficiency and productivity, but not many of them consider what you said. And I agree that point is very important, to have mental health first in place. Otherwise, it's the rest of the things will not come easily. Very important. Thanks, Hugo. And last, would you like to give a question for the next interviewee?
That's an interesting question, the situation. Well, I nowadays I'm a little bit fascinated about major questions in science. How can we define them, from where they came, and how to pursue them? So I would let as a question how this researcher what he or she considers as main questions in science, and how these questions how he defines these questions as major questions in science. What defines a major pursuit in science? I think about that mainly for youngest students or students to think more ambitiously about their own research. What defines a main field of research? What defines a main question? And and that derivates other situations. Am I able to pursue that question? Can I dedicate myself to that? Is it too competitive? So I think something like that.
Very, very interesting question that can give a lot of podcast episodes. Yeah, right. Very interesting. Okay, Hugo. So thanks a lot. It was very nice to having you today in the podcast. You provide a lot of very, very wise answer to all these topics. So, well, I wish you a lot of success into your research. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Ras. It's a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Gracias por estar ahí y por escuchar este podcast. Os recuerdo que en las notas del episodio tenéis los detalles sobre muchas de las cosas que hemos hablado hoy, y también un formulario donde, si quieres, puedes opinar sobre el podcast, para bien o para mal, como quieras. Estás en todo tu derecho. Y también sugerir, si quieres, un próximo entrevistado o tema que está relacionado con la investigación, claro. Pues tu opinión me parece muy importante, tanto a mí como a toda la audiencia de este podcast que va creciendo y que va contando muchas cosas interesantes. También comentar que si te interesa alguna de las técnicas que hemos mencionado hoy de manera muy breve en el podcast, me puedes contactar directamente y te puedo dar más detalles. Y por último, si te ha gustado, te agradecería muchísimo que lo recomendases a quien veas que le puede interesar, y difundirlo por las redes sociales o donde sea. Y nada, y si estás en Apple Podcast, pues ponernos ahí 5 estrellas o 4, como quieras. Siempre viene bien. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.